You are about to learn about a Roman emperor, Nero, who castrated his slave, Sporus, and married him after he mistakenly kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death, and even called Sporus Poppaea Sabina in private. All these happened during his last 3 years of his life, between 65 AD and 68 AD. So the question is, do we call this love or power intoxication? Leave your opinion in the comment section after the documentary. In the year 66 AD, Emperor Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus arranged a ceremony in Greece that stunned even those long used to his excesses. During his imperial tour through the Greek cities, he ordered the kind of event that defied the norms of Roman law, religion, and reason alike. It was not a festival in honor of Apollo or Dionysus, but a wedding, his own. The partner chosen for the Emperor of Rome was not a senator's daughter, not a foreign queen, but a young slave boy named Sporus. Sporus had already been mutilated under Nero's command. Castration was common in certain parts of the empire for singers or servants, but in this case, it was deliberate and personal. Nero wanted to prevent the boy from maturing into manhood. The emperor's reason, as understood by those around him, was that Sporus bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea Sabina, Nero's late wife, who had died the previous year. Nero's desire to restore what had been lost took shape in the body of this enslaved youth. The ceremony followed the formalities of a Roman marriage as closely as possible. The setting was lavish: torches, musicians, attendants, and witnesses drawn from the imperial retinue that had accompanied Nero across the Aegean. Sporus was dressed in the garments of an empress. He wore the veil of a Roman bride, the flammeum, dyed deep orange, and a crown of flowers. The emperor himself assumed the role of husband, standing before priests who performed the traditional rites. He presented a dowry to the bride, publicly declared the union, and sealed it before his audience. The spectacle was no mere rumor. Accounts from those who later chronicled Nero's reign describe the event with consistent detail. They record that Sporus was henceforth called Poppaea, and that Nero introduced him as his consort at banquets and public gatherings. Sporus accompanied the emperor wherever he went, sat beside him in the imperial chariot, and even appeared in state functions where Poppaea herself had once stood. To understand why this act shocked the Roman world, it helps to recall what marriage meant in the empire. A Roman marriage, the connubium, was a contract between two citizens of opposite sex, designed to produce legitimate heirs and cement alliances between families. It carried legal consequences and social expectations. Nero's imitation of this sacred institution with a castrated slave broke the moral and legal fabric that underpinned Roman identity. Yet no one present dared to object. The emperor's word was law, and those who had challenged him before had not survived to speak again. The choice of Greece as the location was deliberate. By 66 AD, Nero had embraced the culture of the Hellenic world with almost religious devotion. He admired Greek art, theater, and athletic contests, seeing himself not as a ruler of legions, but as an artist favored by the gods. In Greece, he felt free from the constraints of Roman tradition. It was there that he competed publicly in musical and dramatic festivals, forcing judges to award him victories, and there that he could stage a marriage that Rome would never have tolerated within its own city walls. The entourage attending the emperor included senators, officers, and courtiers who followed out of fear or ambition. They applauded when required and maintained silence when shocked. To them, The marriage was a symptom of the emperor's growing detachment from reality. The empire was vast, stretching from Britain to Syria, and its ruler now behaved like a performer consumed by his own theater. Sporus himself was young, likely in his mid-teens. Nothing of his origin is known beyond his enslavement. After the ceremony, his role was carefully constructed to mirror that of the deceased Poppaea Sabina. He was addressed by her titles, surrounded by her attendants, and dressed in her jewels. Nero's words to him, recorded later by witnesses, were the same he once used for his wife. It was as if the emperor refused to accept death as final and sought to recreate what had been taken from him by force of will. Those close to power understood the danger of interpreting the event openly. In Rome, satire circulated privately among the elite. Some poets and pamphleteers mocked the emperor, but only in secrecy. To speak publicly against Nero could mean execution or exile. The Senate, long stripped of its authority, remained silent. The marriage became another entry in the growing list of imperial absurdities, an episode whispered about in private villas and foreign provinces, proof that the empire's master had crossed every boundary of moderation. Beyond the scandal, the wedding revealed how far Nero's reign had drifted from the administrative discipline of his predecessors. The emperor had once been seen as a patron of the arts and a reformer of taxation. Now he ruled through impulse and spectacle. His authority no longer rested on law or military success, but on the fear he inspired and the performances he staged. The ceremony also served a political function. By presenting Sporus as his Empress, Nero signaled that his personal desires were the new law of Rome. It was an assertion that even gender, identity, and tradition could bend to imperial will. The empire's hierarchy, from the Senate to the provinces, was reminded that resistance to Nero's imagination was futile. After the wedding, Nero returned to performing across Greece, taking part in musical contests in cities such as Corinth, Athens, and Delphi. Sporus accompanied him to each venue, seated near the stage or traveling beside the emperor in ceremonial processions. Their union was paraded as part of Nero's new vision of Rome, a cultural empire united under his artistry. When word of the marriage reached Rome, reactions were mixed. The common people, long accustomed to rumors of Nero's eccentricity, were less shocked than the aristocracy. Among senators and traditionalists, however, the event confirmed their worst fears, that Nero's rule had become a personal tyranny untethered from Roman values. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's body of elite soldiers, remained loyal only because of the pay and privileges he granted them. Behind the facade of celebration, resentment was spreading through every layer of power. The marriage of Nero and Sporus marked a turning point in perception. It symbolized the emperor's descent from governance into self-worship. The act of marrying a castrated slave was not just moral excess. It was political suicide carried out in slow motion. The same man who had once been hailed as Princeps Juventutis, the leader of youth, now mocked the traditions that sustained the empire's identity. In later months, Nero's fascination with Sporus did not wane. He continued to treat him as Poppaea reborn, addressing him with endearments used for the late Empress and presenting him in official processions. When ambassadors or foreign rulers were received, Sporus stood at the emperor's side, silent but visible. This display turned private obsession into public statement, reinforcing the sense that Rome's ruler had abandoned reason for delusion. The marriage ceremony of 66 AD was not an isolated curiosity. It was the visible outcome of a deeper pattern that had begun years earlier, when Nero's authority became inseparable from his personal desires. Those who witnessed it understood that the empire was being led by a man who no longer distinguished between theater and rule, between grief and governance. By the end of that year, the empire's outer provinces were restless, the treasury depleted, and the Senate increasingly alienated. Yet Nero continued to tour Greece with his Empress. The empire watched, powerless, as its leader redefined the meaning of power itself, not through war or law, but through the transformation of a slave into the reflection of a dead woman. This marriage, conducted openly and acknowledged by the imperial court, became one of the most notorious acts of Nero's reign. It exposed how unchecked authority could distort both custom and conscience. In the eyes of later historians, the event in Greece symbolized the point at which the empire's greatest power turned inward, consumed by the will of one man who mistook his fantasies for truth. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus became emperor in October of AD 54, at only 16 years old. His accession marked the continuation of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus. Yet, his rise was not a product of military conquest or political maneuvering of his own. It was the design of others. Chief among them were his mother, Agrippina the Younger, and the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus, along with the philosopher Seneca, who served as his tutor and advisor. Agrippina had engineered her son's path to the throne with precision. She married the reigning emperor, Claudius, her uncle, in AD 49, and within 5 years she secured Nero's adoption as Claudius's heir, overriding Claudius's own son, Britannicus. When Claudius died in October AD 54, poisoned by a dish of mushrooms, most suspected Agrippina's hand in it. Whether she directly orchestrated the death or not, she ensured that Nero's succession was immediate and unchallenged. The Praetorian Guard, loyal to her through Burrus, hailed the young man as emperor. At first, Nero's reign began with promise. Under the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, the empire saw administrative stability and restraint unusual for an adolescent ruler. Official decrees were tempered by moderation, and justice was carried out with less cruelty than in Claudius's later years. Nero's early speeches, crafted by Seneca, emphasized clemency and good governance. He was presented to the people as a benevolent prince, cultured, youthful, and humane. In these first years, Agrippina believed herself to be the true power behind the throne. She expected her son's obedience, attending Senate sessions beside him, and even receiving foreign embassies as though she shared imperial authority. Her influence was visible on coinage, where her face appeared alongside Nero's, an unprecedented act in Roman politics. But as the young emperor matured, he began to chafe under her control. By AD 55, tension between mother and son had become a political struggle. Agrippina sought to assert her authority by siding with Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, whom she now presented as a rightful alternative to Nero. The move backfired. Britannicus died suddenly during a banquet that same year, poisoned before the eyes of guests. The court whispered Nero's name, though some suspected Agrippina's involvement as well. With Britannicus gone, Nero's position was secure, and Agrippina's usefulness diminished. The next step was distancing her from power. Nero stripped her of her guards, her public honors, and her residence within the imperial palace. She was moved to a separate villa along the river. From that moment, Nero began to rule more independently, but his decisions grew less measured. Without his mother's constant supervision, the emperor turned to pleasures that would soon define his rule: music, theater, racing, and extravagant games. By AD 56, Nero was already showing signs of obsession with performance. He practiced the lyre for hours each day, performed in private gatherings, and entertained courtiers who dared not criticize his talent. Seneca and Burrus tolerated these indulgences at first, hoping they would keep him occupied and away from politics. But indulgence gradually replaced governance. At the same time, Nero began his relationship with Poppaea Sabina, a woman of ambition and influence. Poppaea was married to Otho, one of Nero's close friends, but she set her sights on the emperor himself. Beautiful and intelligent, she recognized Nero's insecurities and fed his desire for admiration. By AD 58, she had become his mistress, and Otho was sent away from Rome under a diplomatic pretext. Poppaea's presence deepened the rift between Nero and his mother. Agrippina disapproved of the relationship, viewing Poppaea as a manipulative threat. She reportedly tried to remind Nero of his duties and warned him that the Roman people would despise a ruler swayed by a courtesan. Nero interpreted these warnings as interference. Poppaea, in turn, used them to fuel his resentment. The struggle reached its peak in AD 59. Agrippina's influence had dwindled, but her survival remained a danger to Nero. She still had allies in the Senate and among the legions, men who saw her as a legitimate stabilizing force. Poppaea, by contrast, urged Nero to act decisively. The emperor's advisors later claimed that Poppaea goaded him, asking whether he planned to rule or remain a child under his mother's command. Nero decided that Agrippina had to die. The method chosen was elaborate. He invited her to a banquet at Baiae, a resort town in Campania, and offered to escort her back to her villa on a specially constructed ship designed to collapse at sea. On the night of the feast, Agrippina boarded the vessel, unaware of its hidden mechanism. After sailing a short distance, the ship's canopy collapsed and part of the hull gave way. Agrippina survived the initial attempt, swimming to shore with the help of her attendants. When word reached Nero that his mother had escaped, panic replaced calculation. He feared exposure. Soldiers were dispatched to finish the act. Agrippina was killed in her villa that same night, struck down by naval officers sent under imperial orders. Nero's reign had entered a new phase, the phase of blood. The death of Agrippina marked the end of restraint. Burrus and Seneca, though still in office, found themselves increasingly sidelined. Nero no longer sought counsel. He demanded obedience. His performances in public became more frequent, his spending more reckless, and his isolation from reality more evident. The philosopher and the general who had once shaped his early rule could only watch as their pupil transformed into the tyrant later remembered by history. In Rome, public mourning for Agrippina was forbidden. Her name was removed from inscriptions, and those who spoke of her death with sympathy risked accusation of treason. Yet her absence created a vacuum that Poppaea quickly filled. By the end of AD 59, she had become the most influential person in the imperial court. These 5 years, AD 54 to 59, formed the foundation of everything that followed. Nero began as a figure of promise, a ruler whose youth and education seemed to herald renewal for Rome. But the machinery of power, personal ambition, and unchecked desire reshaped him. His relationship with Agrippina, once a source of legitimacy, became a contest of dominance that ended in matricide. By the close of the decade, Nero stood alone at the height of imperial power. He had silenced his mother, neutralized rivals, and surrounded himself with flatterers. The boy emperor who once spoke of mercy now ruled through fear. The Rome that had once cheered his accession would, within a few years, come to dread his name. Poppaea Sabina's entrance into Nero's life signaled a turning point in his reign and in the moral temperature of the Roman court. She was not born into obscurity, nor did she rise by chance. Poppaea came from a respected Roman lineage, the daughter of Titus Aulus and Poppaea Sabina the Elder, a woman celebrated for her beauty but forced to end her life under suspicion during the reign of Caligula. Through her family ties, Poppaea was connected to the political elite of Rome. She was raised among the expectations of influence and the culture of ambition. By the time she reached adulthood, Poppaea's reputation for beauty had spread widely through the city. Ancient accounts often emphasize her physical allure, but that alone cannot explain her ascent. In the Roman imperial world, beauty was a currency only when paired with intellect and calculation. Poppaea possessed both. She understood how appearances and alliances could shape power, and she learned early to use her presence as a political tool. Her first marriage was to Rufius Crispinus, a commander of the Praetorian Guard under Claudius. Through him, Poppaea entered the highest social circles of Rome, attending court events and imperial ceremonies. Their marriage produced a son, also named Rufius Crispinus. Yet ambition often made her restless. Crispinus's fall from grace and later execution under Nero's rule severed any link between her and the old Claudian establishment. Poppaea moved quickly to secure her position through a new alliance. Her second marriage, to Lucius Otho, a wealthy and well-connected Roman, brought her even closer to the imperial household. Otho was one of Nero's earliest companions, a young aristocrat known for his extravagance and charm. Through him, Poppaea gained direct access to Nero's private circle, an opportunity she recognized immediately. The Roman court was a theater of flattery, and she played her role with precision. She made herself visible where it mattered and invisible when it did not. By AD 58, her relationship with Nero had turned from casual acquaintance to open intimacy. The affair became difficult to conceal, even in a court accustomed to scandal. Otho, though publicly humiliated, was dispatched to Lusitania as governor, a diplomatic exile designed to remove him from Rome without incident. Poppaea remained in the capital, now effectively installed as Nero's mistress. At this stage, Nero was still married to Claudia Octavia, the daughter of Claudius and his adoptive sister. Octavia was popular among the people for her modesty and lineage, but she was politically passive. Poppaea, by contrast, was active, persuasive, and unafraid to involve herself in matters of state. She understood the emperor's weaknesses, his need for admiration, his insecurity about legitimacy, and his growing detachment from traditional politics. Poppaea's approach was methodical. She encouraged Nero's artistic ambitions, praising his performances and suggesting that the emperor's talents were divine gifts. She also positioned herself as a voice of reason, offering advice in private that he could later claim as his own in public. This blend of flattery and subtle direction made her indispensable. As Nero drifted from the council of Seneca and Burrus, Poppaea filled the vacuum with her own influence. Between AD 58 and 62, Her presence reshaped the character of the imperial court. Banquets grew more elaborate, performances more frequent, and expenditures more excessive. Nero's circle of entertainers, actors, and charioteers began to overshadow traditional senators and military officers. Poppaea's tastes, luxury, spectacle, and display mirrored Nero's inclinations. Together, they embodied a new type of imperial image, theatrical, self-indulgent, and divorced from Roman austerity. Seneca and Burrus recognized the danger. They had guided Nero toward moderation in his early years, but Poppaea's arrival undermined their authority. Seneca's writings from this period reflect his frustration with moral decay and the corruption of power, likely veiled commentary on the state of the court he could no longer control. Burrus, aging and increasingly sidelined, retained nominal command of the Praetorian Guard but could not restrain the emperor's impulses. In AD 59, the rift between Nero and Agrippina widened into outright hostility. Poppaea played a central role in this transformation. She reportedly told Nero that as long as his mother lived, he would never be free. Her words reinforced his resentment, giving emotional form to political necessity. Agrippina's death later that year removed the last check on Nero's behavior and cleared the path for Poppaea to ascend further. The next 3 years, from 59 to 62, marked Poppaea's consolidation of influence. She was no longer merely a mistress, she was a political partner. She began to appear in public ceremonies beside Nero, often dressed in imperial finery. Coins from this era depict a shift in imagery. Nero's face paired not with his mother's, as before, but alone or with symbols of divine favor. Poppaea's hand was evident in the presentation of Nero as a godlike artist emperor rather than a traditional ruler. In AD 62, two events permanently altered the balance of power. First, Burrus died, removing the last stabilizing figure in Nero's administration. Second, Seneca requested permission to retire, citing health and age. Both men, who had guided the emperor since his youth, were gone. Poppaea filled the resulting vacuum. That same year, Nero moved to finalize his separation from Claudia Octavia. The divorce was announced publicly on grounds of infertility, a politically safe pretext. Yet the public sympathized with Octavia, not Nero. Crowds gathered in protest, demanding her reinstatement. Statues of Poppaea were attacked in the streets, while those of Octavia were restored by the people. The unrest forced Nero to pause, but only temporarily. Poppaea, unshaken, maneuvered carefully. She reminded Nero that Octavia's continued existence posed a political risk, that as long as she lived, factions loyal to the old dynasty could use her as a rallying point. Within weeks, Octavia was accused of adultery, placed under house arrest, and eventually executed on the island of Pandateria. The execution, though justified by false evidence, effectively secured Poppaea's position. In the summer of AD 62, Nero married Poppaea Sabina, formally making her Empress of Rome. The wedding was celebrated in a traditional ceremony, and her status was confirmed by the Senate. For Nero, the union represented triumph over the constraints of family and tradition. For Poppaea, it was the culmination of years of calculated advancement. As Empress, Poppaea's influence extended beyond the palace. She was said to have supported policies favorable to the provinces of the East, particularly Egypt, where the cult of Isis thrived, an early sign of the empire's cultural shifts. She also championed the construction of temples and public baths, acts that projected an image of refinement and generosity. By AD 62, the Rome of Nero's early reign had vanished. The moderation of Seneca and Burrus had been replaced by the extravagance of Poppaea and her circle. The emperor now lived within a world designed to please him, a world where dissent was treason and luxury was proof of divine favor. Poppaea's rise was more than personal success. It was symbolic of a new imperial culture defined by spectacle and indulgence. In her, Nero found both reflection and reinforcement. She shared his appetite for attention, his contempt for restraint, and his belief that image could substitute for substance. The partnership between Nero and Poppaea reshaped the Roman court, but it also set in motion the pattern that would lead to tragedy. Ambition, flattery, and indulgence could sustain power for a time, but not indefinitely. Beneath the surface, resentment among the Senate and the army was growing, and the empire's foundations were beginning to crack. As AD 62 closed, Nero stood at the height of imperial splendor, newly married to Poppaea Sabina. The young empress had achieved everything ambition could offer. Yet in the years that followed, her influence, so carefully built, would become inseparable from the story of Nero's decline, his obsession, and the dark legacy that history would remember. By AD 62, the Roman Empire had entered a new political climate. Nero's reign, once moderated by the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, now revolved around personal impulse and court intrigue. The emperor's marriage to Poppaea Sabina signified not only a private victory, but a transformation in how imperial authority functioned. Poppaea's beauty and intellect were matched by her ambition, and her influence reached into nearly every corner of Nero's governance. The balance of power within the palace shifted permanently after the elimination of Claudia Octavia. Octavia's death remains one of the most defining acts of Nero's middle reign. She had been married to Nero for nearly a decade, and despite his infidelities and neglect, she retained public sympathy. Her modesty and lineage, daughter of the deified Claudius, made her the embodiment of traditional Roman virtue. Poppaea's ascension threatened that image. The emperor's divorce from Octavia on claims of infertility provoked unrest across the capital. Statues of Octavia were restored by the people after Nero ordered them removed, and protests filled the streets. For a ruler accustomed to adoration, the reaction was intolerable. Poppaea understood the danger. Her marriage would never be secure while Octavia lived. She advised Nero to act swiftly under the pretext of protecting the regime from internal sedition. In June AD 62, Octavia was accused of adultery with the musician Anicetus, an accusation widely recognized as false. She was exiled to the island of Pandateria, the same place where her mother, Messalina, had once met her death. Within days, Nero ordered her execution. Her head was sent to Poppaea as proof. The event marked the final removal of any remaining ties between Nero and the Claudian legacy. Poppaea was now the unchallenged empress, honored by senators and courtiers alike. Her portraits and statues appeared across the empire, depicting her as the new ideal of Roman femininity, serene, divine, and untouchable. In the imperial household, her word carried near equal weight to Nero's. Poppaea's influence extended into both domestic and foreign affairs. She favored greater tolerance toward the Jewish population in Rome, likely due to her association with Jewish and Eastern communities through trade and religion. Some sources suggest she corresponded with Jewish leaders and sought to ease restrictions on religious practice. Within the palace, her presence softened certain imperial edicts but hardened others, especially those dealing with threats to Nero's authority. Nero's dependence on her deepened. He spent more time in private performances, chariot races, and architectural projects designed to glorify his rule. Poppaea encouraged these pursuits, aware that they elevated her own status. She hosted lavish gatherings at the Golden House, Domus Aurea, where poets, artists, and foreign envoys mingled under her watch. The empire's resources poured into such displays, each event designed to reinforce the divine image of the emperor and empress. By AD 63, Poppaea had become pregnant. The pregnancy was celebrated as a national event, and Nero's excitement bordered on obsession. He ordered public sacrifices for her health and promised grand festivals for the child's birth. When a daughter was born in January AD 63, she was named Claudia Augusta, uniting both branches of the imperial family in symbolism. The infant was given divine honors from birth, though she died within months, an early foreshadowing of the instability that would mark the years ahead. Despite the loss, Poppaea retained her position and influence. Her hold over Nero was personal as much as political. He saw in her an equal partner in spectacle, someone who reflected his image to him in idealized form. Yet, by AD 64, cracks began to appear in the empire. That July, the Great Fire of Rome broke out, consuming 10 of the city's 14 districts. For 9 days, flames ravaged the capital. Ancient sources disagree on whether Nero was in Rome when it began. Some place him at Antium, but all record his actions after the disaster. Nero's response to the fire shaped his reputation for centuries. He organized relief efforts, opened the imperial gardens to refugees, and arranged for grain imports to prevent famine. Yet suspicion quickly turned against him. Rumors spread that the emperor himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his new palace complex. Others claimed he sang and played the lyre while the city burned. The truth remains uncertain, but perception became reality. Poppaea stood beside Nero during the crisis. She advised him on public relations and the rebuilding of the city. Under her influence, Nero implemented new urban regulations, wider streets, fire-resistant materials, and stricter building codes. These measures were practical but also political, reinforcing his control over reconstruction. The Domus Aurea, a vast palace complex filled with gold, marble, and artificial lakes, became the symbol of his recovery plan. To the people, it appeared as self-glorification amid ruin. The fire also marked a turning point in Nero's treatment of dissent. To deflect blame, he accused the small but growing Christian community of arson. The resulting persecution, the first organized attack on Christians in Roman history, was brutal and public. Thousands were executed, burned, or thrown to animals in the arena. Poppaea's role in this remains debated. While some accounts describe her as sympathetic to Jewish causes, none portray her as a restraining force during this campaign. By AD 65, Rome had grown uneasy. The treasury was depleted, the Senate resentful, and conspiracies against Nero multiplied. The most serious was the Pisonian conspiracy, led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator who aimed to replace Nero with a more moderate ruler. The plot was uncovered in April AD 65. Over 100 people were implicated, including senators, officers, and even Nero's former tutor, Seneca. Executions followed swiftly. Seneca was forced to take his own life. an event that symbolized the moral end of Nero's early regime. During these years, Poppaea remained at the center of imperial life. Her public image blended piety, elegance, and authority. She often appeared beside Nero at games, ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions. Foreign ambassadors treated her with deference usually reserved for the emperor himself. Her influence on fashion and court decorum spread through the elite women of Rome, who imitated her hairstyles, cosmetics, and manner of dress. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Nero's emotional volatility was worsening. The combination of isolation, paranoia, and unchecked power eroded his stability. Poppaea, accustomed to commanding influence through subtlety, sometimes challenged him directly in private. According to multiple accounts, their arguments grew intense, often over trivial matters magnified by Nero's temper. In the summer of AD 65, one such quarrel ended tragically. Tacitus records that while Poppaea was pregnant again, Nero, in a fit of anger, struck her in the abdomen with his foot or fist, causing fatal injuries. Suetonius and Cassius Dio provide similar accounts, but vary on the details, some suggesting she died after childbirth complications rather than physical assault. Whatever the cause, Poppaea Sabina died in July AD 65. Nero's reaction combined grief and excess. He arranged a state funeral of unprecedented scale. Her body was embalmed with rare spices and placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, the resting place of Rome's greatest rulers. The Senate decreed her divine honors, and she was worshipped as Diva Poppaea. Nero forbade any public criticism of her or her death, turning mourning into a political performance. Her death marked a profound turning point in Nero's final years. The emperor's behavior became erratic, drifting further from reality. Poppaea's absence left a void he could not fill, yet he refused to let her memory fade. Within months, he began searching for someone who resembled her, a living reflection to replace what had been lost. That search would lead him to a young slave named Sporus and to one of the most infamous episodes in Roman imperial history. Between AD 62 and 65, Poppaea's rise and fall encapsulated the volatility of Nero's Rome. She had ascended through ambition and intellect, wielded influence with precision, and died amid the excess she helped create. The accounts of her death differ, yet all sources agree that it occurred in 65 AD, at a time when Nero's empire was already straining under conspiracies and public discontent. Poppaea Sabina, born around 30 AD, had risen from minor nobility to the most powerful woman in the Roman world. Before becoming Nero's wife, she had been married to Otho, one of Nero's close associates who would later become emperor himself in 69 AD. Her beauty, intelligence, and political ambition were noted even by her enemies. She knew how to maneuver through court politics, and Nero was fascinated by her from the beginning. When she became empress in 62 AD, Poppaea's influence over Nero intensified. She encouraged him to distance himself from his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who still attempted to control imperial affairs. Agrippina's death in 59 AD, carried out by Nero's orders, removed that restraint, leaving Poppaea as the most significant voice in the emperor's private life. For a time, her hold over him seemed absolute. Poppaea gave birth to Nero's daughter, Claudia Augusta, in January 63 AD. The emperor celebrated her birth lavishly. naming the child Augusta and granting her divine honors, a rare gesture for an infant. But tragedy struck months later when the child died, likely in the same year. The loss marked the beginning of tensions between Nero and Poppaea. Some accounts suggest Nero's grief turned to bitterness. Others claim that Poppaea's ambitions pushed her to pressure him constantly, both personally and politically. By 65 AD, Nero's rule was marked by paranoia. The Pisonian conspiracy, a major plot to assassinate him, had just been uncovered. Several senators, equestrians, and even his old tutor Seneca were implicated and executed. The executions had shaken Rome's elite and isolated Nero from the aristocracy. It was in this climate of distrust that Poppaea's death occurred. The cause of her death remains one of the most debated details of Nero's reign. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, gives the most cited version, that Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked Poppaea in the abdomen while she was pregnant, killing both her and the unborn child. Suetonius and Cassius Dio repeat similar versions, though the exact wording and context differ. According to these sources, Nero struck her after she complained that he had returned late from the races. However, not all historians accept this account as literal. Some modern interpretations propose that Poppaea died from complications of pregnancy or childbirth rather than violence. The Romans were aware of the dangers of childbirth, and even women of privilege were not immune. Still, the persistence of the story, that Nero killed her in anger, says much about how his contemporaries and later chroniclers viewed his rule. After Poppaea's death, Nero's reaction was outwardly extravagant. He gave her a state funeral, an honor usually reserved for members of the imperial line. Her body was not cremated in the traditional Roman fashion, but instead embalmed in the Egyptian style, using spices and unguents. This unusual choice reflected Nero's fascination with foreign customs and his wish to preserve her beauty even in death. Her ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, symbolically uniting her with Rome's first imperial dynasty. Poppaea was deified after her death, another sign of Nero's obsession with her memory. He ordered temples and altars to be built in her honor. Statues of her were erected throughout the empire, depicting her as a goddess. Yet these gestures were not signs of devotion alone. They also served as political displays, meant to reassure the public that the emperor remained in control, even as whispers spread about his guilt. The death of Poppaea marked a turning point in Nero's psychological state. Those close to him observed a noticeable shift. He became more erratic, more detached from governance, and increasingly absorbed in personal indulgence and artistic pursuits. His involvement in the performing arts, singing, acting, and competing in Greek-style games, intensified. The line between emperor and performer blurred further. Behind the public display of mourning, Nero's household underwent subtle but significant changes. Poppaea had been the stabilizing figure in his personal circle. Without her, Nero surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants. Freedmen such as Tigellinus, the Praetorian prefect, gained more influence. It was Tigellinus who encouraged Nero's theatrical impulses and helped him suppress dissent. In the wake of Poppaea's death, Nero's grief took an unusual and disturbing turn. Within a year, he began showing a peculiar fixation on a young slave named Sporus, who bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea. Sporus was likely between 13 and 17 years old when Nero noticed him. The emperor saw in him not only a reminder of his lost wife, but a vessel through which he could attempt to recreate what he had destroyed. By 66 AD, Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated, preventing him from developing masculine features. The act was both symbolic and personal, an effort to mold Sporus into the image of Poppaea. Nero even began referring to him by Poppaea's name and dressing him in her clothes. This disturbing reconstruction of a lost relationship reflected the depth of Nero's detachment from reality. While Poppaea's death was a domestic tragedy, it had far-reaching political effects. Her death left Nero without a legitimate heir, weakening the Julio-Claudian Dynasty's continuity. Rome's senatorial class, already alienated by Nero's executions and extravagance, viewed the emperor's behavior as confirmation of moral collapse. Rumors of divine punishment and madness began circulating. The empire itself was still stable in 65 AD. The army remained loyal, and the provinces were relatively quiet, but cracks were appearing. Nero's neglect of administration, combined with heavy taxation to fund his artistic ventures, fostered resentment. The death of Poppaea, once seen as the empress who could moderate his excesses, removed one of the last remaining barriers between Nero and complete self-destruction. From this moment onward, the emperor's rule became increasingly detached from political reality. The following years would see him pursue theatrical performances in Greece, force Roman nobles into humiliating displays of adulation, and marry Sporus in a public ceremony that shocked even his closest allies. In essence, Poppaea Sabina's death in 65 AD was not an isolated domestic tragedy. It was the catalyst for the emperor's final descent into delusion and infamy, the moment when Nero's public authority and private obsession became indistinguishable. What followed was not merely a scandal. It was the unraveling of an emperor's grasp on Rome itself. Her death ended one chapter and opened another, the unnatural union between Nero and Sporus, which would become one of the most infamous episodes in Roman history. By the year 66 AD, Nero had crossed a line even by the debased standards of imperial Rome. Poppaea Sabina was dead, the Senate feared him, and his public behavior had grown unpredictable. Out of this moral and political decline came one of the most bizarre acts ever recorded of a Roman emperor: the castration of a young boy named Sporus, whom Nero sought to turn into a living replacement for his dead wife. Sporus's early background is largely unknown. Ancient accounts describe him only as a young slave of remarkable beauty, owned by one of Nero's attendants or possibly by the imperial household itself. He was likely in his mid-teens, a time when Roman boys still retained youthful features. Nero noticed him sometime after Poppaea died in 65 AD, likely during one of his private court events or performances. Sporus's resemblance to Poppaea was immediately remarked upon by those around him. His soft face, fair skin, and delicate features reminded Nero of the woman he had lost. By early 66 AD, Nero's obsession had turned into action. He ordered Sporus to be castrated, preventing the boy's body from developing masculine traits. In Roman society, castration was viewed with disgust and was largely outlawed, especially for citizens. But the emperor was above the law. Nero's decision was not motivated by cruelty in the conventional sense. It was an attempt to recreate Poppaea physically. This act was both a psychological projection and imperial demonstration. If Rome's gods could not restore the dead, Nero would do so himself. The operation would have been brutal. Roman surgical techniques were primitive, and no effective anesthesia existed. Historical sources do not describe the procedure in detail, but it was likely performed by a physician or court attendant under direct orders. The purpose was not just to sterilize, but to halt hormonal development, freezing Sporus's body in a state of androgynous youth. That Nero was willing to subject another person to this mutilation shows both his power and his detachment from moral restraint. After the castration, Nero's obsession deepened. He had Sporus dressed in Poppaea's robes and jewels, and even gave him her favorite titles. Nero called him Sabina, referring to Poppaea's family name. Sporus was also treated as the Empress would have been, accompanied by attendants, adorned in imperial garments, and displayed in public alongside Nero. The emperor's court watched in silence as this grotesque mimicry unfolded. This was more than private madness. In Roman politics, appearances mattered. Nero's decision to transform a slave into a simulacrum of his wife had implications for his reputation. To his enemies, it confirmed the emperor's insanity. To his supporters, it was a display of ultimate dominance, an emperor so powerful he could defy the natural order. Ancient historians were unanimous in their condemnation. Suetonius described how Nero castrated the boy Sporus and tried to make of him a woman, and even married him with all the usual ceremonies. Cassius Dio confirmed that the emperor conducted an actual wedding ceremony, complete with dowry, veil, and attendants, the same honors once given to Poppaea. These accounts are consistent with Nero's behavior in other areas, where he blurred the line between theater and life. The ceremony likely took place in 66 AD, possibly in the imperial palace in Rome. Nero appeared in a woman's dress, while Sporus was formally presented as his wife. The witnesses included members of the imperial court, freedmen, and praetorian officers. The Roman elite would not have dared object. The emperor's whims were law. What shocked them most was not the ceremony itself, but Nero's insistence that Sporus be treated as a genuine empress thereafter. From that moment, Sporus accompanied Nero everywhere. In public, he appeared by the emperor's side in gilded litters, just as Poppaea once had. When Nero traveled to Greece in 66 to 67 AD, Sporus went with him. Nero even took him to performances and games, presenting him to audiences as though he were divine. For Nero, Sporus had ceased to be a person. He was an artifact, a living monument to a lost obsession. Yet within this story lies another layer, the role of power and control. Castration was not merely an act of grief. It was also an assertion of dominance. Nero had reduced another human being to an extension of his will, reshaping him physically and socially. Sporus became the emperor's living proof that nothing, not even gender, not even death, could resist imperial authority. Sporus himself remains a tragic figure. He had no agency in what was done to him. Despite being publicly honored, he was a captive within Nero's world. Roman society viewed eunuchs with suspicion, and although Sporus was treated as an empress, his existence was a constant reminder of Nero's excess. As Nero's reign continued, rumors spread across Rome about the emperor's relationship with Sporus. The Senate whispered of madness. The common people mocked the emperor's bride. Satirical graffiti appeared on city walls, comparing Nero's marriage to a parody of Roman virtue. But no one dared to confront him openly. By the end of 66 AD, Nero's behavior had alienated nearly all political allies. His obsession with Sporus coincided with growing unrest in the provinces. Revolts were brewing in Judea, and the army in Gaul had begun murmuring discontent. The emperor, however, seemed indifferent. His attention was consumed by his performances and his new wife. In private, Nero reportedly called Sporus Poppaea and treated him with elaborate tenderness. He gave him access to the imperial treasury, presented him with fine jewels, and surrounded him with attendants. These gestures, though outwardly affectionate, were rooted in delusion. Nero was not honoring Poppaea's memory. He was attempting to resurrect it through imitation. By 67 AD, this relationship had become a symbol of Nero's reign, extravagant, perverse, and detached from political reality. When the emperor traveled to Greece to participate in public games, Sporus traveled with him dressed in royal attire. Nero performed in theaters, sang on stage, and competed in athletic contests, while Sporus acted as his ceremonial consort. To Greek audiences accustomed to mythic pageantry, the pairing seemed strange but not entirely alien. To the Romans, it was humiliating. The castration of Sporus was the physical manifestation of Nero's self-deception. It revealed how far he had drifted from the responsibilities of rulership. By trying to recreate his wife in another body, Nero crossed the line between emperor and parody. Rome's leaders would not forget it. When the revolt against Nero began in 68 AD, Sporus was still by his side. As the emperor's political world collapsed, the boy who had been forced to live as Poppaea became one of the last symbols of his madness. The act that began as private mourning ended as a public warning. The story of a ruler who sought to remake reality itself and lost his empire in the process. The castration of Sporus in 66 AD thus stands not as an isolated scandal, but as a defining episode of Nero's rule. It encapsulated the emperor's self-indulgence, his disregard for Roman norms, and his fatal obsession with image and performance. From this point onward, Nero was no longer the ruler of Rome. He was the performer of his own decline. By AD 66, Nero's behavior had moved fully beyond the limits of Roman decorum. What had started as a disturbing personal fixation evolved into a formal, state-like act, a marriage ceremony between the emperor of Rome and the castrated youth Sporus. Ancient chroniclers did not exaggerate this event. It truly occurred, witnessed by courtiers and recorded by multiple sources. In the eyes of Rome, it was both grotesque and revealing, a symbol of how the imperial court had turned into a stage for the emperor's delusions. The ceremony took place during Nero's imperial tour of Greece in 66 AD, a journey he undertook to indulge his fascination with Greek culture and the performing arts. Nero's trip was part of his effort to reshape his image as an artist emperor rather than a statesman. He performed in theaters, sang in competitions, and presided over games modeled on the ancient Olympics. The marriage to Sporus, conducted amidst this spectacle, fit naturally into the environment Nero had created, one where the boundaries between art, ritual, and governance had completely dissolved. Sporus was no longer simply a favored companion. Nero had begun to present him publicly as Poppaea reborn. Courtiers addressed him by her name, and attendants treated him with the respect due to an empress. In the months following Poppaea's death, Nero had already begun reconstructing her image through Sporus's body. The marriage made it official. Every element of a traditional Roman wedding was observed, not as parody, but as deliberate imitation. Historical records note that Sporus wore a bridal veil, known as a flammeum, a deep orange-red cloth that symbolized modesty and fertility. He also received a dowry, though the exact amount is unrecorded. Nero himself played the role of groom. officiating with ritual gestures expected of a Roman husband. The pair exchanged vows before witnesses, and the ceremony ended with a formal procession. It was the same structure that would have been used for the marriage of a noble Roman woman, except that this union defied nature, religion, and law. The reaction of those present is lost to time. No one would have dared object. The emperor's command carried the weight of divine will. Yet behind the silence, disapproval simmered. The Senate had already begun to view Nero as unstable, and the army's loyalty was weakening. Every new act of extravagance eroded his legitimacy further. But Nero either did not notice or did not care. He believed his genius placed him above Roman norms. After the ceremony, Nero treated Sporus exactly as Poppaea had been treated in life. Sporus was now addressed publicly as Empress, attended by imperial servants, and seated beside Nero at official events. When the emperor gave public performances, Sporus appeared in the imperial box, dressed in silk garments, adorned with jewels that once belonged to Poppaea. At banquets, Nero would call him by her name and speak to him as if she had never died. For the emperor, the ceremony had achieved its purpose. Sporus was not merely a replacement. He was a restoration. From the outside, this act was both sacrilegious and politically dangerous. Roman emperors were expected to uphold the appearance of moral authority, even when their private lives were corrupt. Nero had done the opposite. His marriage to Sporus turned private indulgence into public spectacle. To conservative Romans, it was evidence that the emperor had abandoned Roman mos maiorum, the ancestral customs that upheld the dignity of the state. Still, there was a logic to Nero's madness. In his mind, the marriage symbolized triumph over death. Poppaea had died, but through imperial will, she had been remade. The ceremony was therefore less about love and more about power. It was a statement that the emperor's authority extended beyond the natural limits of life, gender, and morality. Nero was declaring himself not only ruler of Rome, but master over nature itself. The political cost was immense. Word of the ceremony spread through the empire. Provincial governors, military commanders, and senators began to see Nero not as a godlike artist, but as an unstable ruler. In the East, Greek audiences accepted the performance with curiosity, but in Rome, it deepened the growing sense of unease. The empire's soldiers, bound by discipline and masculine virtue, were particularly repelled by the idea of a bridegroom emperor. Yet Nero continued undeterred. He and Sporus traveled through Greece together as a royal pair. In every city, Corinth, Athens, and Delphi, Nero staged grand performances, while Sporus sat near him, adorned in royal attire. When Nero appeared in chariot races or musical competitions, Sporus was visible to the crowd, silent but symbolic. To the Greeks, it resembled myth, perhaps the rebirth of a lost queen or the emperor's tribute to Aphrodite. To the Romans who later heard the reports, it sounded like blasphemy. By this time, Nero's priorities had shifted completely away from the administration of the empire. His ministers, including Helius and Polyclitus, managed state affairs while he indulged in performances. The empire still functioned, but its leadership was drifting. Nero's marriage to Sporus reflected that disconnect, an emperor more absorbed in fantasy than governance. The imperial household adapted to the new reality. Sporus's role as empress was not limited to private chambers. He performed ceremonial duties, accepted greetings, and accompanied Nero during processions. In Rome, statues and inscriptions still bore Poppaea's name, but those who attended court began to whisper that she lived again in Sporus. The line between memory and present had blurred completely. The act of marrying Sporus was not only personal, it was political theater. Nero's reign had always blended art and authority. His decision to formalize the marriage in public, rather than keep it a private indulgence, demonstrated his belief that he could redefine Roman values through spectacle. What had once been scandal was now ritual. The emperor was rewriting the meaning of imperial power. Sporus's existence within this system was complicated. Outwardly, he lived in luxury, attended by servants and honored by courtiers. But his identity had been erased. The name Sporus itself, derived from the Greek sporos meaning seed, was ironically cruel. He had been rendered incapable of procreation. Within Nero's court, he was both visible and voiceless, revered and imprisoned. By the end of 66 AD, Nero's marriage to Sporus had become a topic whispered across the empire. The Senate tolerated it in silence, but it reinforced the growing view that the emperor had lost touch with reality. Meanwhile, unrest continued to spread in the provinces, and the empire's political structure began to strain. This union between emperor and eunuch stood as the defining symbol of Nero's last years. It showed how the boundaries of power had dissolved under his reign. The ceremony itself, while described in scandalous terms by later historians, was more than personal depravity. It was the ultimate display of imperial delusion, a ruler so consumed by grief, pride, and control that he sought to turn history itself into a stage for his private theater. By the time Nero returned to Italy in AD 67, his empire was already fracturing. Revolts in Gaul and Hispania were taking shape. His political authority was eroding. Yet even as rebellion brewed, Nero continued to present Sporus as his wife, traveling with him in the same manner Poppaea once had. The marriage that no one dared to stop had become the emblem of an emperor's self-destruction, an empire collapsing under the weight of one man's imagination. By AD 66, the Roman Empire was entering a period of internal corrosion that mirrored the emperor's own mental and moral collapse. Nero, once hailed as a promising young ruler, had lost all interest in administration. His focus had shifted entirely toward artistic expression, public performance, and his self-fashioned legend as a divine entertainer. Nero's purpose was personal, to compete publicly in the sacred games of Greece, win acclaim as a performer, and prove his artistic supremacy to the Greek world. Greece in the 1st century AD was under Roman control but retained enormous cultural prestige. Nero idolized its traditions, theater, music, philosophy, and sought to present himself as their living embodiment. In the autumn of AD 66, he arrived in Corinth, where he announced the liberation of Greece, declaring that all Greek cities were henceforth free. The act was largely symbolic. The Roman military still governed the region. But to Nero, it was theater on a grand scale, a gesture of magnanimity designed to elevate his image among the Greeks. Sporus traveled beside him throughout this journey. Wherever Nero appeared in public, on stage, at games, or during parades, Sporus stood near him, dressed in Poppaea's imperial garments. Observers described how the emperor would address him as Empress and even bring him gifts before audiences. The visual effect was deliberate. Nero wanted the people to see Poppaea alive again, to believe that his power could transcend mortality. The emperor's performances were extensive. He sang in musical contests, acted in plays, and drove chariots in athletic games. The Greeks, long accustomed to ritualized spectacle, received him with enthusiasm and deference. Victories were prearranged. In every competition Nero entered, he was proclaimed the winner. He accumulated hundreds of crowns, awards that had once represented the highest artistic and athletic honors of the ancient world. Behind the scenes, however, his absence from Rome was creating instability. The Senate resented being ignored. Provincial governors began to act independently, exploiting the vacuum of leadership. Military discipline eroded. The treasury, drained by Nero's extravagance, verged on collapse. The empire's frontiers, from Britain to Judea, grew restless under weak administration. In AD 66, rebellion erupted in Judea when Jewish factions rose against Roman rule. The governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, attempted to suppress the revolt but failed. It was a critical warning sign that Nero's empire was starting to fracture. Yet the emperor gave little attention to the crisis. His thoughts remained fixed on his performances, his image, and the adulation of the Greek audiences who flattered him as a living god. During this same period, Sporus's visibility within Nero's entourage increased. He acted as the emperor's companion and ceremonial consort, greeting delegations, appearing at banquets, and riding in the imperial chariot. His presence served a purpose beyond personal attachment. He was part of Nero's public narrative. The cost was staggering. Rome's finances, already strained by years of neglect, approached crisis. When Nero visited Delphi, he performed before the oracle of Apollo, interpreting his own verses as divine revelation. In Athens, he reenacted mythological scenes from the tragedies of Euripides. He even entered contests meant for professional actors, a shocking breach of Roman dignity, since the stage was traditionally reserved for slaves and foreigners. Yet Nero saw himself not as an emperor performing in disguise, but as a god manifest through art. Meanwhile, back in Rome, resentment hardened into opposition. Senators and aristocrats who had long tolerated Nero's eccentricities began to speak privately of rebellion. Among the provinces, two names emerged as symbols of discontent: Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, and Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Both men commanded military forces, both had long histories of loyalty to Rome, and both were losing patience with Nero's neglect. By early 67 AD, murmurs of revolt began to circulate. The empire was stretched thin. Soldiers, unpaid and disillusioned, were more loyal to their generals than to the distant emperor. The Senate, powerless and fearful, waited for a sign of change. Nero, oblivious, continued performing, surrounded by sycophants and artists who reinforced his illusions of grandeur. Throughout this time, Sporus remained close, silent witness to the emperor's descent. His life followed Nero's schedule: performances, ceremonies, and processions. In public, he was displayed as the Empress Poppaea, a symbol of permanence in a reign built on impermanence. In private, he endured the volatile moods of an emperor increasingly detached from reason. Nero's tour of Greece culminated in the Isthmian Games at Corinth. There, he announced plans to dig a canal through the isthmus, a project intended to symbolize his dominion over nature. Thousands of laborers were conscripted for the task, but little was completed. Like many of Nero's ambitions, it was more performance than substance. The emperor personally struck the first blow with a golden pickaxe before a crowd of officials, poets, and slaves. The image was clear. Nero saw himself as a builder of worlds, yet he was dismantling his own. As the tour concluded in late AD 67, Nero returned to Italy triumphant in his own mind. He brought with him trophies, musicians, and actors, along with Sporus, who continued to be treated as his wife. He expected celebration and loyalty upon his return. Instead, he found an empire unraveling. The provinces were in open revolt, the treasury was empty, and his authority was crumbling. The year 67 AD exposed the full extent of Nero's isolation. He was no longer the emperor of Rome in any practical sense. He had become a performer supported by an empire that could no longer afford his illusions. The Senate despised him, the army distrusted him, and the people mocked him. His marriage to Sporus, once a symbol of control, now appeared to everyone as a sign of derangement. Still, Nero clung to his fantasy. He refused to return to serious governance or address the revolts gathering momentum in the western provinces. Instead, he hosted new games, staged more performances, and continued to live within the theatrical world he had built for himself. The empire had begun to break apart, but Nero, insulated by flattery and delusion, saw only applause. By the close of AD 67, the emperor's isolation was complete. Those around him no longer advised him, only agreed with him. His world revolved around Sporus, the last remnant of a past he could not release, and the echo of a woman he had destroyed. The next year would end it all, not just Nero's reign, but the entire Julio-Claudian Dynasty that had ruled Rome for more than a century. By the time Nero publicly paraded Sporus as his consort in 66 AD, Rome's patience with its emperor was near exhaustion. What began as amusement among the Roman elite soon hardened into disgust. The marriage between emperor and eunuch exposed not just Nero's personal decadence, but also the empire's deep moral and political fatigue. Senators, praetorians, and citizens, each group saw the spectacle differently, but all recognized that Rome had crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. For the Roman aristocracy, Nero's union with Sporus was not only scandalous, but politically catastrophic. Rome's upper class had long tolerated excesses in exchange for stability. But by the late 60s AD, Nero had drained the treasury, alienated the Senate, and extinguished nearly all respect among the military. The Sporus affair became an emblem of his reign's decay, a symptom of power unchecked by tradition or decency. To the senatorial mind, this was the final insult. The emperor who once sang in theaters now pretended to marry a castrated slave in the open. The people of Rome, however, were divided. Among the lower classes and freedmen, there was fascination and curiosity. Nero had long cultivated the image of a populist emperor, one who lowered grain prices, built new entertainment venues, and performed publicly as a musician. His popularity had survived even after the Great Fire of 64 AD, though barely. But by 66 AD, his performances and extravagance had turned grotesque. To see their emperor adorned in Greek robes, calling a eunuch Poppaea, and walking in processions as if he were a bride or groom, was unsettling even for those accustomed to Roman eccentricity. Many Romans recalled how, just a few years earlier, Nero had reportedly kicked Poppaea Sabina to death while she was pregnant. Her beauty and influence had been legendary. To then see Sporus, castrated, dressed as her, and paraded in her name, felt to some like blasphemy. Nero's attempt to resurrect Poppaea through imitation only deepened his isolation. The more he tried to replace what was lost, the more the people recoiled. Behind the palace walls, the imperial court seethed with fear and hypocrisy. Few dared to speak against the emperor's actions, but whispers carried through the corridors. High-ranking officials such as Tigellinus, Nero's praetorian prefect, continued to indulge him, encouraging his excesses to maintain favor. Meanwhile, others like Nymphidius Sabinus and certain senators began to measure the shifting balance of power. They recognized that Nero's grip was weakening, that the loyalty of the army, especially the legions in Gaul and Spain, was fading fast. When Nero toured Greece in 66 to 67 AD to perform at festivals and receive honors as a godlike artist, Sporus accompanied him. The tour was meant to bolster Nero's prestige abroad, but in reality, it revealed how detached he had become from Rome's political core. Sporus was constantly at his side, treated as Empress, dressed in fine silks and jewels, and even referred to as Augusta by the entourage. For the Greeks, used to divine rulers and gender-bending myths, the display was peculiar but not unthinkable. For Rome's senators, however, it confirmed that their emperor had abandoned any pretense of Roman virtue. In early 68 AD, reports of rebellion reached Nero. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gaul, rose against him, soon joined by Servius Sulpicius Galba in Spain. The empire was fracturing. Nero's self-indulgence, theatrical displays, and erratic policies had drained his authority. Even his Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal, began to turn. The image of Nero marrying a castrated boy was circulated among his enemies as proof of divine punishment and moral ruin. Pamphlets and speeches in the provinces mocked him as a womanish emperor, unfit to lead legions. When Nero returned from Greece to face the growing crisis, he was no longer greeted with cheers, but with suspicion. The senators who had once flattered him now conspired for his downfall. In the last months of his rule, Rome itself became tense and fearful. Executions, confiscations, and denunciations rose again as Nero sought to root out betrayal. Sporus remained beside him through it all, present during imperial meetings, processions, and even as Nero planned his escape, when news came that the Senate had declared him a public enemy. By June 68 AD, it was over. Galba's forces advanced toward Rome, and the Praetorians deserted Nero. He fled with a few loyal freedmen, including Sporus, to a villa outside the city. There, as soldiers closed in, Nero faced the inevitable. His last recorded words, "What an artist dies in me," captured his delusion to the end. He stabbed himself in the throat on June 9, 68 AD, bringing an end to the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. For Sporus, the fall of Nero was both release and new imprisonment. He was taken by Nymphidius Sabinus, who hoped to use him for his own political theater, attempting to marry him publicly, echoing Nero's spectacle. Sporus refused. Not long after, humiliated and cornered, he took his own life. The Roman people did not mourn Nero. The Senate restored old ceremonies and condemned his memory through damnatio memoriae, erasing his name from inscriptions and statues. Yet the story of Sporus remained, a strange echo of power, cruelty, and obsession that revealed the twisted heart of the final years of Nero's Rome. In retrospect, the scandal of Nero and Sporus was not merely about perversion or excess. It was a mirror reflecting Rome's exhaustion. The empire had grown vast, rich, and unstable. Power had become theater, and the line between ruler and actor had dissolved. In the spectacle of a eunuch called Poppaea and an emperor who believed himself divine, Rome saw the final act of a dynasty devoured by its own vanity. By the close of 68 AD, the empire stood leaderless, and the stage Nero once commanded was filled by rivals: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, vying for control. But the tale of Sporus endured, not as gossip, but as testimony, a small, brutal truth about what absolute power does when it loses the world's respect. The summer of 68 AD was the end of an era, the fall of Nero, the collapse of the Julio-Claudian line, and the silent unraveling of everything that Rome had built under its first emperors. The emperor who once ruled with the authority of Augustus and the theatrical flair of a god had become a fugitive. The Senate had declared him a public enemy, his guards had abandoned him, and the people of Rome, once his cheering crowd, had turned away in silence. When Nero fled the city, he was not alone. Among the handful who followed him into exile were his loyal freedmen, Phaon, Epaphroditus, and Sporus. The escape began late on the night of June 8, 68 AD. Nero disguised himself in plain clothes, a scarf covering his face, and mounted a horse with his companions. They fled along the Via Salaria toward the villa of Phaon, located just a few miles outside Rome. Every noise in the distance made Nero tremble. He had ruled through fear, but in those final hours, fear had turned on him. When they reached the villa, Nero was exhausted and delirious. He refused to believe that the Senate had condemned him to die the death of a traitor by scourging and execution in the Forum. But the message was clear: Rome was done with him. The Praetorian Guard had already pledged allegiance to Galba. Inside the villa, Sporus stood by silently as Nero's freedmen argued about what to do. They urged the emperor to take his own life, sparing himself the humiliation of capture. Nero hesitated. For hours, he wandered the house, muttering, "Is there no one left who loves me?" His mind turned back to Poppaea, to the theater, to the days when the crowd cheered his name. To him, death was not punishment. It was the end of an unfinished performance. By dawn, the soldiers were closing in. Dust rose on the road leading to the villa. Nero heard the hoofbeats and panicked. "They come to take me to the Forum," he whispered. In that moment, he realized there was no escape. He asked Sporus to hand him a dagger. The boy obeyed, his expression unreadable. Nero pressed the blade to his throat, but lacked the courage to finish it. Epaphroditus, one of his freedmen, helped him drive it home. As blood filled his mouth, Nero's final words were recorded by ancient historians. "Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me." It was not a confession or repentance. It was vanity until the last breath. He died on June 9th, 68 AD, at 30 years old. Rome's emperor, musician, and tyrant lay dead in a borrowed villa, buried hastily in the tomb of the Domitii Ahinobarbi by his few remaining servants. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The Senate declared Nero's name damned. Statues were torn down, inscriptions erased, and his memory formally condemned under damnatio memoriae. For the first time since Augustus, Rome had no emperor. The empire plunged into chaos. The year of the four emperors would follow. Sporus, once Nero's living symbol of power and perversion, was captured soon after. At first, he fell into the custody of Poppaea Sabina, the ambitious Praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero and now sought to seize the throne for himself. Sabinus was fascinated by Sporus's appearance and his history with Nero. In a display of grotesque irony, he planned to marry Sporus publicly, just as Nero had done. But Sporus refused. The thought of repeating the farce, of once again being paraded before the Roman public as a symbol of imperial lust, broke whatever will he had left. He had been stripped of his body, his name, and his freedom. Now they demanded his humiliation again. Before the ceremony could take place, Sporus took his own life. The date is uncertain, but it occurred in 68 AD, not long after Nero's death. His death went largely unnoticed by the public. Rome was too consumed by new rebellions, shifting loyalties, and the rise of Galba. Yet in private circles, the story of Sporus spread as a whispered reminder of the empire's corruption. For the political elite, it was a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when the line between emperor and despot vanishes. In the years that followed, historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio recorded fragments of the story. They did not pity Sporus, nor did they glorify Nero. Their accounts were clinical, almost detached, but beneath them lay a recognition of something tragic, the destruction of identity under the weight of imperial obsession. Sporus had been turned into an imitation of the dead, Poppaea's ghost living under a false name. After Nero's death, the empire transitioned through violence. Galba ruled for a few months before being murdered by Otho, who had once been Poppaea's husband. Then came Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, who restored a measure of order. Yet even as Rome stabilized, Nero's name haunted its politics. Pretenders would later emerge claiming to be Nero resurrected, seeking to exploit the nostalgia of those who once adored him. Sporus, though long gone, remained part of Nero's legend. His image endured as a cruel reminder of what Nero's reign had become, a distortion of power, art, and human dignity. In Roman memory, Sporus was both victim and reflection. He showed what happened when the emperor's desires replaced law, when human life became theater. By the end of 68 AD, both Nero and Sporus were dead, their bond erased, but not forgotten. Their story was never officially commemorated in inscriptions or monuments. It survived only through texts, each one written by men who despised Nero yet could not look away from his spectacle. Rome moved on. The Flavian dynasty built new monuments, restored the treasury, and reopened the arenas. But the shadow of Nero lingered in the empire's collective mind, a warning that no amount of stone or ceremony could fully cleanse the memory of an emperor who had turned Rome into his stage and its people into unwilling spectators. The death of Nero marked the end of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. The death of Sporus marked the end of Nero's illusion, the final collapse of his private world where he believed love, art, and cruelty could exist without consequence. Together, their story closed one of the darkest, strangest chapters in imperial history. When later Romans spoke of Nero's fall, they remembered the fires, the music, and the madness. But in the quieter corners of that history, they also remembered the boy who had once been renamed Poppaea, the one who followed Nero into exile and watched him die. It was a small, brutal truth that revealed how power, once corrupted by self-worship, devours not only its enemies, but its own creations. The events between 65 and 69 AD form one of the clearest case studies in how absolute power corrodes the mind and distorts human relationships. The story of Nero, Poppaea, and Sporus does not simply recount the fall of an emperor. It reveals how unchecked authority, vanity, and grief can mutate into something unrecognizable, an empire built on performance rather than principle. When Nero came to power in 54 AD, the Roman world still operated under the illusion of republican virtue, cloaked in imperial form. By 65 AD, that illusion was gone. The emperor's authority was no longer balanced by Senate influence or moral restraint. The machinery of empire served one man's desires, and in that environment, his personal life became state business. The line between public power and private obsession ceased to exist. Poppaea Sabina's rise illustrated how beauty and intelligence could be wielded in Rome's political sphere. She had navigated marriage, scandal, and imperial ambition with precision, using charm as influence. But her death in 65 AD exposed Nero's inability to process loss within human boundaries. What followed, his search for her reflection in the boy Sporus, was not merely the act of a man in mourning. It was the final symptom of a ruler whose reality had fractured under the weight of unrestrained dominion. Castrating Sporus to make him resemble Poppaea was more than cruel. It was elevated to a ritual. Nero's actions turned the human body into a political statement. The emperor could reorder nature itself to satisfy memory. In a sense, Sporus became the empire in miniature, reshaped, renamed, and forced into compliance with Nero's imagination. Rome, like Sporus, was no longer a living entity, but an extension of its master's will. The public marriage in 66 AD symbolized this complete inversion of Roman norms. The emperor's act mocked the legal, religious, and moral codes that once structured society. Marriage, in Rome, represented continuity, lineage, and civic order. Nero transformed it into a spectacle where gender, status, and decorum existed only to be redefined by his performance. The Senate watched in silence, the populace gossiped, and the empire quietly absorbed the message. Law was now theater. Sporus's role in that theater underscores the hollowness of imperial identity. He was both visible and voiceless, adored and objectified. His survival depended on submission, yet his existence also threatened to expose Nero's madness. Within the court, he was treated as Poppaea reborn, yet everyone knew he was not. That contradiction, an emperor demanding that fiction be accepted as truth, mirrored Rome's own political decay. By 67 AD, reality itself had become a function of imperial command. When Nero died in June 68 AD, Rome entered a phase of violent correction. The empire could no longer sustain his illusion. Revolts erupted, generals turned against one another, and within a year, for emperors would rise and fall before stability returned under Vespasian. But the damage Nero had done was not just political, it was cultural. His reign had shown that image could dominate substance, that personality could replace governance. The idea of the emperor as an artist, performer, or divine figure would echo long after his ashes cooled. Sporus's death, though quiet and largely forgotten by his contemporaries, completes the story. His suicide, following attempts by Nymphidius Sabinus and Vitellius to use him again as a political symbol, reflected the emptiness of Nero's legacy. The boy who had once embodied the emperor's fantasy was now reduced to an instrument of others' ambition. His refusal to play that part again, choosing death over spectacle, was the only act of autonomy left to him. From a historical standpoint, the episode reveals the transformation of imperial Rome from a system of inherited power into a culture of personality. Under Augustus, the emperor ruled by consensus and image management. Under Nero, that image became the entire reality. The personal had consumed the political. The emperor's moods shaped policy, his obsessions dictated ritual, and his fantasies became law. What makes the story endure is not its scandal, but its precision as a study of power's psychology. Nero's behavior was not random. It followed the logic of total authority. Without resistance or accountability, even the absurd becomes possible. Castrating Sporus was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the natural conclusion of a ruler who believed the world existed to mirror his desires. By the time Nero died, Rome's elite had learned a difficult truth. When one man's imagination governs millions, reality itself becomes unstable. The same empire that once prided itself on discipline and order now found its ruler dressing as a bridegroom, racing chariots, and playing the lyre while provinces rebelled. The tragedy of Nero was not only his fall, but the realization that Rome had enabled it. Sporus's story forces modern readers to confront the human cost of that complicity. Behind the satire and the horror lies a record of exploitation, of how individuals are consumed when caught inside systems built on the worship of power. The Roman historians who preserved these accounts were not moralists, but chroniclers of cause and effect. To them, the degradation of the imperial household reflected the degradation of the state itself. Between 65 and 69 AD, every boundary in Roman life blurred between art and politics, grief and madness, ruler and god. The result was a government that existed only to sustain the emperor's self-image. When that image collapsed, so did the illusion of permanence that had sustained the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. The empire survived, but it emerged altered, more cynical, more conscious of the dangers that lurked in absolute rule. In later centuries, Nero's name would become a symbol, sometimes of tyranny, sometimes of decadence, sometimes of misunderstood genius. But beneath all the retellings, one truth remains consistent. His reign revealed the emptiness of power detached from restraint. Poppaea's beauty, Sporus's suffering, and Nero's self-destruction were all variations of the same theme: the corrosion of identity under domination. By the end of this 4-year sequence of events, the empire had changed forever. Nero's death ended one dynasty, but the lessons of his reign shaped every emperor who followed. Rome learned that loyalty enforced through fear cannot outlast the man who commands it, and that an empire built on spectacle must eventually face the silence that follows when the performance ends. The story of Nero, Poppaea, and Sporus remains not a moral tale, but a record of consequences. It shows, with brutal clarity, how a single life, once elevated beyond question, can warp the world around it. Power without balance becomes self-parody. Grief without boundary becomes cruelty. Between 65 and 69 AD, Rome witnessed both. In the ruins of that history, one figure stands out not as emperor or empress, but as a reminder: Sporus, the human echo of an empire that forgot the difference between love and possession.